America didn't defeat its enemies in World War II. It removed their ability to survive. That sounds extreme, but it's the only way to explain what actually happened. Most people believe wars are won by firepower, bravery, or decisive battles. But the most important victories of World War II didn't happen on the battlefield. They happened in planning rooms, on maps, inside timelines the enemy could no longer keep up with. Millions of soldiers died not because they were overpowered, but because they were placed into situations where every option led to death. They didn't know they were surrounded. They didn't know the war had already moved past them. They kept waiting for orders, supplies, reinforcements, none of which were ever coming. This video is not about famous generals or heroic charges. It is about something far more unsettling. How a small number of decisions quietly turned war into a machine with no exits. You will hear familiar names, but you will see them differently. Not as legends, but as architects of systems that killed faster than bullets. Systems that collapsed enemy armies without fighting them head-on. Systems that made surrender meaningless and resistance irrelevant. Here is the paradox few people talk about. Some of the most humane victories in World War II caused the most unavoidable deaths. By the end of this story, you won't just know what happened. You'll understand why the war turned when it did, and why those reasons are almost never explained. This is the hidden logic that reshaped World War II, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Still watching? This story isn't going where you think. Stay with it because understanding how this war was won matters more than knowing who won it. When people hear the word lethal, they imagine explosions, gunfire, and bodies on a battlefield. They imagine violence made visible. But World War II proved that visibility is not what makes war deadly. Structure is. The most destructive decisions of the war were often made far from the front line on maps, timetables, and supply charts. They did not aim to defeat the enemy in combat. They aimed to erase the enemy's ability to function. To understand why certain American commanders changed the course of the war, we must abandon the popular definition of military success. Victory was not about courage. It was not about aggression. And it was not even about winning battles. It was about removing options. In war, survival depends on choice. The choice to attack or retreat. The choice to hold ground or abandon it. The choice to wait for reinforcements or fall back to regroup. Once those choices disappear, death becomes a process rather than an event. World War II was the first conflict in which industrial-scale warfare collided with human decision-making limits. Armies moved faster than intelligence systems could track. Supply chains stretched across continents. Command structures became so complex that a single delay could doom tens of thousands of men. This is where lethality truly emerged. Not in how fiercely a unit fought, but in how efficiently it was placed into a situation where fighting no longer mattered. Entire enemy formations were destroyed without being decisively defeated. They were bypassed, isolated, cut off, and left behind by a war that no longer needed to engage them. Some soldiers died waiting for orders that never arrived. Others held positions that no longer existed on operational maps. Many were technically undefeated, but strategically irrelevant. They were alive in theory, dead in practice. This is the distinction most histories fail to explain. The generals who mattered most were not always the ones who advanced the farthest or spoke the loudest. They were the ones who understood that war is not a contest of strength, but a contest of systems. Systems of movement, systems of supply, systems of time. When those systems collapse, individual bravery becomes meaningless. A rifle is useless without ammunition. A defensive line is useless if the enemy arrives before it is built. An army is useless if it cannot move, resupply, or receive orders. The most lethal American commanders recognized this early. They stopped thinking in terms of battles and started thinking in terms of inevitability. If the enemy retreats, they die later. If they hold their ground, they die sooner. If they surrender, they are already irrelevant. In all three cases, the outcome is the same. This is why casualty numbers alone tell only part of the story. What mattered was how those casualties were produced. Some commanders inflicted heavy losses through speed, moving so quickly that the enemy never had time to adapt. Others weaponized presence, breaking resistance before engagements even began. Some applied mathematical precision, grinding enemy forces down with timing and coordination. and one perfected isolation, allowing entire armies to collapse without firing a shot at them. These approaches were not accidents. They were deliberate evolutions in how war was conducted. World War II forced the United States to learn a brutal lesson. The fastest way to end a war is not to destroy the enemy's army, but to destroy the enemy's ability to choose. Once that happens, fighting becomes irrelevant. Victory becomes inevitable, and death becomes quiet. This is the framework we will use going forward. Not who was the most famous, not who was the most aggressive, but which decisions transformed war into a machine with no exits. Speed is usually described as an advantage in war. In World War II, it became something far more dangerous. It became a weapon, not because it allowed armies to move faster than the enemy could fight, but because it allowed them to move faster than the enemy could think. Every army plans based on assumptions. How long it takes for an enemy unit to march, how quickly supplies can arrive, how much time exists between detection and contact. Those assumptions form the invisible framework of defense. Once they are wrong, everything collapses. In World War II, American commanders learned that destroying enemy units was not always necessary. If you moved faster than their intelligence systems could process, you didn't need to defeat them. You simply arrived where they never expected you to be. And when that happened, resistance stopped being a choice. Enemy defenses were designed for a war that no longer existed. Artillery positions were planned for timelines that had already expired. Reserves were placed where the enemy used to be, not where they were going. By the time reports reached headquarters, the situation had already changed. Speed didn't just break lines, it broke causality. An army that cannot predict where the enemy will appear cannot defend itself. An army that cannot defend itself begins to retreat. And an army that retreats without coordination disintegrates. This is how speed turns into lethality, not through violence, but through inevitability. Once the tempo of war accelerates beyond human reaction time, every defensive decision becomes late. Every order arrives after it is needed. Every response is made to a situation that no longer exists. World War II revealed a hard truth. Modern armies do not collapse because they lose battles. They collapse because they lose time. Entire formations were rendered irrelevant without being decisively engaged. They were bypassed, surrounded indirectly, or forced to abandon positions simply because holding them no longer made operational sense. From the soldier's perspective, nothing felt wrong until suddenly everything was. Orders contradicted reality. Maps no longer matched terrain. Friendly units were gone, replaced by enemy forces moving through areas that were supposed to be secure. This is where casualties spike, not during heroic last stands, but during retreats, confusion, and fragmented resistance. Speed amplifies death not at the front, but in the aftermath. Men are killed while repositioning. Convoys are destroyed while moving. Units surrender not because they are beaten, but because they no longer know where they are. The psychological effect is just as devastating. When soldiers realize the enemy is operating faster than their command structure can respond, confidence evaporates, discipline weakens, initiative disappears. No one wants to be the last unit holding ground for a plan that no longer exists. At that point, the war has already been decided. This is why speed became one of the most lethal forces in the American way of war, not because it looked dramatic, but because it denied the enemy the ability to stabilize. Once stabilization fails, collapse follows. And collapse produces casualties at a scale that no single battle ever could. Speed creates a war where survival depends on decisions made hours earlier, decisions the enemy never had the chance to make. By the time they realize what is happening, the window has closed. The trap is already set. The exits are already gone. This is not chaos. It is control. And once speed is weaponized, the enemy is no longer fighting an army. They are fighting time itself. Speed collapses systems, but speed alone does not break people. World War II revealed another, quieter force, one that worked even when armies stopped moving. Presence. Not presence on a map, not presence in reports, but physical, undeniable presence, where the enemy believed resistance was impossible. In traditional warfare, leadership is distant. Orders move downward. Decisions travel through layers of command. The battlefield is something observed, not entered. In World War II, some American commanders inverted that logic. They understood that fear does not come from firepower alone. It comes from certainty. Certainty that the enemy will not retreat. Certainty that relief will not arrive. Certainty that the person giving the order is exposed to the same danger as everyone else. Once that certainty sets in, resistance changes shape. Soldiers do not ask whether a position can be held. They ask whether holding it is even meaningful. Presence turns leadership into pressure. When commanders place themselves at the point of maximum risk, the battlefield stops being abstract. It becomes immediate, personal, unavoidable. This is not about bravery as a moral trait. It is about consequences. An enemy facing an officer who leads from behind believes the fight is negotiable. An enemy facing an officer who arrives first understands something else entirely. This fight will not end quickly. This position will not be abandoned. This resistance will not collapse due to hesitation. That realization kills faster than artillery. World War II demonstrated that lightly equipped forces could hold ground far beyond their expected limits, not because of superior weapons, but because their leadership removed retreat as a psychological option. Once retreat disappears, the battle becomes asymmetric. The enemy is forced to choose between escalation and withdrawal. Both choices carry unacceptable costs. Escalation requires committing forces into uncertainty. Withdrawal means conceding ground that cannot be recovered. Either way, momentum shifts. This is how presence becomes lethal, not through direct engagement, but through psychological compression. The battlefield shrinks, time compresses. Decisions must be made instantly. Under pressure, without full information, mistakes multiply. Units advance without coordination. Counterattacks arrive piecemeal. Reserves are committed too early or too late. Casualties follow. From the outside, these battles look heroic. From the inside, they feel suffocating. Enemy soldiers describe the same sensation again and again. The sense that they were fighting a force that could not be dislodged, reasoned with, or delayed. That sense breaks morale long before ammunition runs out. This is why presence mattered so deeply in World War II. It did not replace speed, it amplified it. Speed destabilized the system. Presence ensured it never recovered. Even when movement stopped, pressure continued. And pressure produces decisions under stress. The most lethal environment in war. The paradox is uncomfortable. Leadership that appears humane, leadership that shares risk, that stands beside its soldiers, often creates outcomes that are far more destructive for the enemy. Not because it seeks destruction, but because it eliminates uncertainty. Once the enemy understands that resistance will be met immediately, decisively, and without hesitation, options narrow. Fight and suffer losses. Withdraw and lose the war. Wait and be surrounded. These are not tactical dilemmas. They are traps. World War II forced militaries to confront a truth they had long avoided. Battles are not decided by weapons alone. They are decided by how much psychological space is left to the enemy. When that space collapses, casualties are no longer the result of combat. They are the result of inevitability. Speed closes the door. Presence locks it. And once both are in place, the outcome no longer depends on courage, numbers, or even firepower. It depends on how long the enemy can endure a situation with no acceptable choices. Most cannot. The comforting myth about war. That destruction is the result of fury. That the dead are counted by rage, aggression, and brutality. World War II exposed how false that belief really was. Some of the highest casualty figures of the war were not produced by reckless violence, but by restraint by commanders who refused to fight unless the numbers were already decided. This is where war stopped being emotional and became mathematical. Violence feels decisive. It is visible. It satisfies the instinct to act. Mathematics is quieter. It delays action until the outcome is inevitable. In World War II, American command culture split along this fault line. Two philosophies existed at the same time. One believed momentum was everything. Attack quickly. Attack relentlessly. Accept losses if it meant keeping the enemy off balance. The other believed momentum was dangerous. That speed without calculation only multiplied casualties. That the real objective was not territory, but exchange ratios. How many enemy soldiers are removed from the war? and at what cost. This difference reshaped entire campaigns. Violence-driven warfare creates spectacle. Columns advance. Front lines move. Battles are fought and remembered, but it also produces friction. Every assault burns fuel, ammunition, and lives. Every gain must be defended. Every exposed flank creates risk. Mathematical warfare avoids spectacle entirely. It concentrates force. It times attacks precisely. It waits until air, armor, and logistics align into a single overwhelming moment. When the strike comes, it is brief and devastating. The enemy does not experience a battle. They experience collapse. This approach is often misunderstood as cautious or even timid. In reality, it is ruthless. Mathematical warfare does not ask whether an attack is brave. It asks whether it is necessary. If a position can be bypassed, it is ignored. If an enemy formation can be encircled later, it is allowed to advance now. If pressure will break resistance tomorrow, violence is postponed today. To the soldier waiting under fire, this feels cruel. To the system, it is efficient. World War II revealed the cost of impatience. Attacks launched before logistics were ready produced high casualty rates for minimal gain. Breakthroughs attempted without coordination stalled and bled. Aggression without timing turned momentum into attrition. Mathematics prevented that. Not by reducing combat, but by choosing when combat mattered. This is where lethality becomes counterintuitive. The commanders who killed the most enemy soldiers were often the ones who fought less frequently. They did not seek constant contact. They waited until contact guaranteed disproportionate results. When violence finally occurred, it was overwhelming. Enemy units were shattered before they could withdraw. Defensive lines collapsed before reserves could respond. Entire sectors disintegrated in days instead of months. From the outside, it looked effortless. From the inside, it was terrifying. Because mathematical warfare leaves no room for improvisation. There is no heroic counterattack. No last-minute recovery. No second chance. By the time the enemy realizes what is happening, the equation is already solved. This is the paradox at the heart of World War II. The wars that felt the least dramatic often produced the highest body counts. The battles remembered as legendary were sometimes the least efficient. Violence creates stories. Mathematics creates outcomes. And outcomes are what end wars. This does not mean the mathematical approach was humane. It was simply honest. It acknowledged that war is a problem of resources, time, and probability, not a test of courage. When commanders accepted that truth, they stopped wasting lives on uncertainty. They stopped attacking to prove resolve. They attacked only when the result was unavoidable. The enemy felt the difference immediately. Resistance shortened. Surrenders increased. Entire formations ceased to exist without prolonged fighting. Not because they were weak, but because the system no longer allowed them to function. World War II forced a brutal realization. Violence without calculation prolongs war. Calculation without hesitation ends it. The most lethal decisions were not made in moments of anger. Made calmly, patiently, with maps and numbers, long before the first shot was fired. And once those decisions were set in motion, no amount of courage could undo them. Final form of lethality that World War II revealed, one more disturbing than speed, presence, or mathematics. Isolation. Isolation does not look violent. There are no explosions, no advancing columns, no dramatic breakthroughs, and yet it kills with terrifying efficiency. In earlier wars, isolation was temporary. An army cut off from supply would attempt a breakout, negotiate relief, or surrender. The battlefield remained central. World War II changed that. Industrial warfare made isolation permanent. When supply lines stretched across oceans, jungles, and continents, being cut off no longer meant inconvenience. It meant extinction. American commanders learned that fighting every enemy position was unnecessary. In many cases, it was counterproductive. Why destroy an enemy force in battle when you could simply remove its ability to exist? Isolation transformed war from confrontation into abandonment. Entire enemy formations were bypassed, not defeated, not overrun, simply ignored. They were left without resupply, without reinforcement, without purpose. They still had weapons. They still had men. But they no longer mattered. This is the most psychologically devastating form of warfare. An enemy can endure losses. They can survive defeat, but irrelevance breaks something deeper. When soldiers realize that no matter how long they hold out, nothing will change, resistance decays. Isolation turns time itself into a weapon. Food runs out. Ammunition dwindles. Disease spreads. Morale collapses. Not all at once, but inevitably, and inevitability is lethal. What makes isolation so effective is that it removes choice more completely than any other method. Speed forces late decisions. Presence compresses psychological space. Mathematics determines outcomes in advance. Isolation eliminates participation altogether. There is no counterattack to plan, no flank to exploit, no battle to win. The enemy is no longer fighting an army. They are fighting entropy. This is why isolation produces enormous casualties without proportional combat. Deaths occur off the battlefield, in encampments, on islands, in jungles and mountains far from the front. These deaths do not appear dramatic in historical narratives. They do not produce iconic images, but they shape the war more decisively than many famous battles. Isolation also reshapes morality in uncomfortable ways. From a purely military perspective, it minimizes friendly casualties. It avoids costly assaults. It preserves momentum. From a human perspective, it is slow, impersonal, and merciless. Men die not because they were defeated, but because they were forgotten. World War II forced commanders to confront this paradox. Is it better to kill quickly in battle, or to design campaigns where the enemy dies gradually, unseen, and unavoidable? Isolation offered an answer that many preferred not to examine too closely. It allowed wars to end faster. It reduced losses on one side dramatically. And it produced casualty figures that would have been impossible through direct combat alone. This is why isolation became one of the most lethal tools of the war, not because it was crueler than violence, but because it was more efficient. Once isolation took hold, the outcome no longer depended on bravery, discipline, or leadership at the tactical level. Individual heroism became irrelevant. No charge could restore supply lines. No speech could summon reinforcements. No tactical victory could alter strategic abandonment. The war simply moved on, and those left behind became statistics waiting to be counted. This is the ultimate expression of the system described throughout this story. Speed destabilizes. Presence compresses. Mathematics decides. Isolation executes. By the time isolation is complete, the war is already over, even if the fighting has not officially stopped. World War II ended not when the last shots were fired, but when entire enemy forces lost the ability to matter. Isolation ensured that outcome. It is quiet, it is invisible, and it is devastating. This is why the most lethal campaigns of the war were not always the bloodiest ones. They were the ones that left no path back. Point. A pattern should be clear. World War II was not won by a single tactic, a single weapon, or a single personality. It was won when war itself stopped behaving like a series of battles and started behaving like a system. Speed, presence, mathematics, and isolation were not separate tools. They were components. When combined, they created something far more dangerous than firepower. They created inevitability. This is the moment where individual decisions stop mattering and structures take over. In earlier wars, outcomes were fragile. A single defeat could reverse momentum. A bold counterattack could reopen possibilities. A mistake could be corrected. World War II erased that flexibility. Once American operations reached a certain scale, the war no longer reacted to the enemy. It absorbed them. Enemy units could fight bravely and still disappear. They could win tactical engagements and still lose strategically. They could survive today and still be dead tomorrow, not because of failure, but because the system no longer allowed recovery. This is the true definition of lethality. Not killing in the moment, but removing the future. A systemically lethal war does not ask whether the enemy will resist. It assumes they will and renders that resistance irrelevant. Once speed outpaces intelligence, presence compresses morale, mathematics fixes outcomes, and isolation removes participation, the war enters a closed loop. Every enemy action produces the same result. Advance and be bypassed. Defend and be surrounded. Retreat and collapse, wait, and starve. No decision changes the ending. At this stage, casualty figures explode, not because violence increases, but because options disappear. This is why so many World War II campaigns ended suddenly. From the outside, they appear almost effortless. Fronts disintegrate. Armies surrender en masse. Entire regions fall in weeks. But the collapse was already complete long before it became visible. The system had finished its work. This also explains a common misunderstanding. People often ask why some enemy forces continued to fight long after defeat was inevitable, why they resisted when the outcome was clear. The answer is simple. At the individual level, the system is invisible. Soldiers do not see the entire operational map. They do not know which supply lines are gone forever. They do not know which reinforcements exist only on paper. They act on local information, even when the global outcome is already sealed. This disconnect is what makes systemic warfare so devastating. Men die fighting battles that no longer matter. World War II produced casualty numbers that shock us not because humans suddenly became more violent, but because systems became more complete. Once a system is complete, it does not require constant force. It requires maintenance. And maintenance is quiet. Convoys rerouted, airfields seized, ports denied, communications disrupted. Each action seems small. Together, they close every door. This is why some of the most lethal American campaigns involved fewer battles than expected. The fighting stopped, but the dying continued. War, at this level, no longer needs momentum. It needs stability. Once the system stabilizes, resistance fades naturally. The enemy is no longer fighting to win. They are fighting to exist. And existence becomes harder every day. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of World War II. The war was not decided by moments of brilliance or fury. It was decided when one side learned how to build a structure the other side could not escape. A structure where courage had diminishing returns, where sacrifice no longer altered outcomes, where even survival was temporary. This is not a celebration of strategy. It is an explanation. Because once war becomes a system, it no longer ends when one side loses the will to fight. It ends when one side loses the ability to matter. And by the time that happens, the war is already over. Stage, one question becomes impossible to avoid. If a systemized war kills more efficiently, ends conflicts faster, and reduces losses on one side, is it more humane? World War II forces us into a moral contradiction that has never been fully resolved. Traditional warfare looks cruel. Soldiers charge. Battles rage. Bodies fall in visible, immediate violence. Systemic warfare looks cleaner. Fewer battles, shorter campaigns, lower casualties for the victor. But the suffering does not disappear. It simply changes form. Men do not die in moments of chaos. They die slowly, out of sight from hunger, disease, exposure, and abandonment. The battlefield vanishes. The consequences remain. This is the paradox. The strategies that appear less brutal often produce deaths that are more unavoidable. In a traditional battle, there is still agency. A soldier can surrender. A unit can withdraw. A commander can gamble on a counterattack. In a closed system, those options are illusions. The decision was made days, weeks, or months earlier, on a map the soldier will never see. World War II revealed that moral responsibility in modern war does not sit where we expect it to. It does not sit with the rifleman. It does not sit with the platoon commander. Often, it does not even sit with the general on the battlefield. It sits in planning rooms, in logistics calculations, in decisions about which enemy forces are worth fighting, and which can simply be left to disappear. This makes judgment uncomfortable, because systemic warfare does not feel like cruelty. It feels like optimization. It feels rational, professional, necessary, and that is precisely what makes it dangerous. Once efficiency becomes the primary measure of success, human cost becomes secondary, not because anyone desires suffering, but because suffering is no longer visible. World War II normalized this way of thinking. Victory became a matter of exchange rates. Casualties were weighed against objectives. Entire enemy formations were evaluated not by their humanity, but by their relevance. This is not an accusation. It is an observation. War at industrial scale cannot function any other way. But the consequences linger. The soldiers left behind in isolated pockets were not defeated in combat. They were written out of the war. Their deaths were not the result of failure. They were the result of efficiency. This challenges the way we talk about morality in war. Is it more ethical to fight fiercely and kill quickly, or to design wars where the enemy dies slowly but inevitably? Is minimizing your own losses a moral imperative, even if it maximizes suffering on the other side? World War II offers no clean answers. It only shows what happens when nations choose results over appearances. The uncomfortable truth is that systemic warfare reduces heroism on both sides. There are fewer decisive moments, fewer opportunities for redemption, fewer chances for individual action to matter. Courage still exists, but it no longer changes outcomes. This is why World War II feels so modern. Not because of the weapons, but because of the logic. A logic where war ends not when one side admits defeat, but when one side loses the ability to influence events at all. At that point, moral debate arrives too late. The system has already finished its work. Understanding this does not require approval. It requires honesty. World War II was not won by good men defeating bad men. It was won by systems overpowering human limits. And once that threshold was crossed, war stopped being a test of values and became a test of design. This is the moral weight the war leaves behind. Not guilt, not glory, but the question of whether a more efficient war is truly a more humane one. At the end of World War II, something fundamental had changed. Not just borders, not just governments, but the nature of war itself. What defeated the Axis powers was not a single battle, a single weapon, or a single commander. It was the moment war stopped being a sequence of fights and became a structure the enemy could no longer escape. Speed removed time, presence removed hesitation, mathematics removed uncertainty, isolation removed participation. Together, they created a war where outcomes were decided long before the fighting began. This is why so many campaigns ended abruptly, why entire armies surrendered at once, why resistance collapsed in places that had once seemed unbreakable. From the outside, it looked sudden. From inside the system, it was inevitable. World War II did not end because one side ran out of courage. It ended because one side ran out of options. That distinction matters, because it explains something we still struggle to understand today: how wars can be won without appearing decisive, and how enormous human loss can occur without constant violence. The most lethal moments of the war were often invisible. They happened when supply lines were cut, when timelines slipped beyond recovery, when entire formations were bypassed and forgotten. Men died not in dramatic charges, but in silence, waiting for orders that would never come. This is not how war is usually remembered. History prefers clarity. Heroes. Battles with beginnings and endings. Systems offer none of that. They operate quietly, relentlessly, without emotion. Once built, they do not need hatred to function. They only need time. World War II forced every major power to confront this reality. But the United States was the first to fully embrace it, not because of ideology, not because of cruelty, but because industrial war demanded it. At a certain scale, war cannot be fought ethically or heroically in the traditional sense. It can only be managed, and management favors efficiency over emotion. This is the legacy that still shapes modern conflict. Wars today are not designed to be won on the battlefield. They are designed to be won in advance, through logistics, timing, isolation, and pressure applied where resistance cannot form. The battles we see are often the least important part. Understanding World War II through this lens changes how we see everything that came after. It explains why some victories feel hollow, why some defeats feel sudden, why suffering continues long after the fighting stops. And it forces us to ask a final, uncomfortable question. If war is now a system, who is responsible for the outcomes it produces? Is it the soldier following orders, the commander executing doctrine, or the planners who design conflicts where survival is no longer a choice? World War II does not answer that question. It simply shows us the moment when war crossed a threshold, from confrontation to calculation. Once that threshold was crossed, there was no way back. And whether we admit it or not, we are still living with the consequences. This perspective changed how you see World War II. Let me know in the comments. These stories aren't about the past, they explain the wars we still fight today. Subscribe if you want more history that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks.